What's up? It's your boy Cameron at XP, and today we're talking about trim paths in After Effects. We're going to cover the basics of using trim paths, but for those of you with a bit more time and ambition, I'm also going to be sharing some secret tips to level up your trim path game, and we're going to be creating some rad animations like these. But for now, let's just start with the basics. We're inside of After Effects, and I've taken the liberty of creating a composition with these two objects in it, a line and a circle. So if I click on circle, twirl this down, come to add, click on the arrow next to add and come up to trim paths, and then twirl down trim paths, I can play around with these two stopwatches. You can see it kind of does what it says. It trims the path, it grows it on and it grows it off, just using this one stopwatch. And if you want to see the difference between the end stopwatch and the start, it comes down to the directions. So the start is the opposite direction to the end, pretty much. Let's just reset this. Now, if you actually want to animate this, it's quite simple. You can drop in a keyframe for your end, drop in another one 1 second forward, come back to the initial keyframe, drop it to 0. Then if I come to 1 second and click on my start stopwatch, go 1 second further and take that from 0 all the way to 100. I now have an animation where the stroke animates on and then it animates off. And that's pretty much the basics of trim paths. From there, you can just kind of ease it, play around with the timing. To get some interesting things, you can copy and paste with Command or Control C and Control V onto our line, and you'll see exactly the same thing happens. But really, that's all there is to it. From here, this might be enough for you. This might be everything you're looking for. But if you're interested in taking it a little bit further, I'm going to go into some tips and tricks that I've picked up along the way that you might find helpful for your own projects. So let's get into that next. So now we're getting into secret tips, and this is secret tip number 1. Animating a trim path from the center instead of from one side to the other. And the way we're going to animate this is by coming to our start and end stopwatches, and I'm going to change these both to 50, and I'm going to drop in keyframes, come 1 second forward, and I'm going to take the end keyframe to 100 and the start back to 0. And you'll see that animates in from the center. And of course, you can add some easy ease to make it a bit more interesting. You could also copy and paste this and use it with a closed shape, and that'll basically animate in a very similar way. You could also come down to your offset if you wanted this to animate from a different part. So if you wanted it to animate from the top, let's say, you could change your offset to 180, and that's what you'd get. Our next trim path tip relates to the offset function. So I've already created an animation on our circle, and I'm going to now play around with the offset to make something more interesting. I can drop in a offset keyframe, move it to the end, drop in another one. If I change this to something like -180, and let's add some easing to this, you can see that we get a lot more movement in that animation now. And of course, you can change this figure to whatever you want. However, you need to make sure that it's animating in the direction of your end keyframes, because if I give you the exact opposite, kind of does what our previous example does. However, if you were to change the easing of one of these, so I've just hit F9 to reset that. Or if I made this much more extreme, you can see it does some wobblies. So I found it's best to stick to something that's moving in the direction of your previous animation. For this next tip, we're going to be having a look at trim multiple shapes. Right now, we can switch between simultaneously and individually. Doing so when there's only one object inside of your shape layer isn't going to do anything. So if I leave it on simultaneously, but then come up and duplicate this shape internally just a couple times, you can see when it's set to simultaneous, they all animate on at the same time. But change it to individual, and they will animate on one after the other, and this will be affected by the order. Whichever is at the top basically animates on first. For this next tip, I have a line that's animating on and animating off. Now, what I want to talk about is a situation where instead of just a hard line, you're having to animate on a dotted line. So if I add a dash and a gap to this line, let's make the dash 50 and the gap 60. When it's animating on from the end, everything's fine. But see what starts to happen when you start animating the start keyframes. It starts to cascade and slide in this weird way, and that's just not what you want. So I've come up with a solve for this. Maybe you've come across a better one. So if you have, I would love to hear about it in the comments, so pop that in there. But the solution that I've come up with is duplicating this dotted line, changing it to line matte. Then we're going to basically remove the dashes from this line. I'm going to thicken it up, maybe 55. And I'm going to remove the trim path from that dotted line. And I'm going to use the new line matte as an alpha matte for the dotted line. And you can see by doing that, it animates on and animates off perfectly. The final tip is going to be using animation presets to save this animation and reuse it very easily. So if you find that you're using trim paths a lot and you're doing a lot of animating them on and animating off, you can save yourself a heck of a lot of time by turning that animation into an animation preset. So the way that we do that is basically by customizing our animation however we want. So I have this line animating on and animating off, and I'm going to select all of these because I find myself using, let's say, 60 in, 60 out easing a lot. So I'm just going to drop in that easing, and then I'm going to select these animation keyframes. And I'm going to come up to animation, save animation preset, and I'm going to call this trim path effect. And what you're going to want to do is make sure that you're saving this to the right folder so that you can access it later. For me, that's in users, admin, documents, Adobe After Effects, user presets. Anyway, I'm going to save this. So now if I click on my circle, twirl down my animation presets, go to user presets, I have my trim path effect. If I double click on that, it automatically adds that animation right in with very little effort on my part. And this is something you can do with a whole bunch of things. Animation presets can allow you to basically create custom effects for your shape layers or whatever, and you can even stack them. So if you had a bunch of things happening inside of your layer, scale, transform properties, effects, whatever, you could select all of those, create an animation preset, and you could apply these things very easily to layers. Please drop a like and subscribe if you found this helpful so far. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into the fun stuff. We're all about real-life application on this channel, so instead of just learning a technique, you learn how to apply it and use it creatively as well. So when I was designing this tutorial, I thought that instead of animating something new, it would be interesting to deconstruct and replicate a really awesome existing animation that used trim paths or could be made with trim paths. And I ended up with these. These are two animations from a COVID-19 project compiled by The Furrow. There are a whole bunch of designers and studios involved and many more to look at, so I'll link to everything in the description. But for now, let's figure out how these bad boys were made. So this is the first animation that we're going to reverse engineer using trim paths. So what I did for this is I just created this very simple illustration, and then I basically brought that into After Effects. And here you have that composition inside of After Effects. And of course, I've already named all the layers, so we can just dive into this. I created a background layer, which basically just animates on loop over these 3 seconds. And now we can just dive into the animation part of it. So for starters, I'm going to click on line 1 and line 2. And because we've already created our trim path effect, why not use that? So I'm going to double click on our trim path effect, hit U to open up our keyframes. I want everything to happen around about 12 keyframes, so I'm just going to drag everything in. And then I want these end keyframes of both animations to be linear keyframes. If I hit Control and click, that'll change them to linear. And all these initial keyframes I want to change to something strong like 80, an 80% ease. Okay, the next thing I want to do is just offset that animation so they happen one after the other. Now we want to basically mimic that animation with our two dots on either end. We want that to follow the path of these trim paths essentially. So the way that we can do that is click on our lines, come into our search panel and type in path, and our paths show up. So if I drop in a keyframe for both of those, if I hit X on this, it'll close that up, but I'll hit U again to open up those keyframes again. Now our first dot is outside of the screen here, and that corresponds to line 1. So if I come over to this path and Control C on that keyframe, then come up to my dots and hit Alt Shift P, that'll drop position keyframes onto those two dot layers. So if I click on my first dot and now hit Control V, that copies the animation from line 1. So because I used Overlord to get these layers into After Effects, it sometimes does something funny with the position. If you had made them natively inside of After Effects, you wouldn't have this problem. But we have it here and I can show you how to fix that very easily. So if I click on our first line layer, you can see that this point here is where the animation needs to start. So if I select our keyframes and just drag this animation over and click Control, you can see it wants to snap onto things. So I can just come up to that corner and just drop that. And you can see we'll have that animating in the right position. And now all I need to do is match the easing, drag this over where we have that animating perfectly with that trim path. Now we just need to do exactly the same thing for our second ball. Once again, we're going to have to find that snapping position. So if I click on this, here's the edge. If I hold Control, it will snap to that edge. And of course, the direction of this is affected by the direction that the line was drawn inside of Illustrator. And this was drawn in the wrong direction. So I just need to come in here actually and time reverse these keyframes and change the easing to match. Now we have this animating on and the second one animating off. Now, of course, we don't want this to be here at this initial part of the animation, so I'm just going to trim this in, Hold Shift to snap it in. The final thing we need to do is have this ball animate off with this line, and we can just do that by copy and pasting this animation. And you can see in the middle here, because of these handles, we're getting a funny bit of movement. There are many ways to fix this, but what we're going to do this time is just hold Control, Alt, and click on this keyframe. And that turns it into a hold keyframe, and essentially that stops that little wobble happening in between. Now we basically have exactly what we're looking for. Now we still have this final line to animate, and I thought we could do this a little bit differently, try a different technique, and perhaps learn some new things along the way there as well. So we basically have these two dots in this line, and I'm going to use Create Nulls from Paths, and this is a native plugin that comes with After Effects, and this can be very useful if you want to animate your path or have things follow your path, whatever. But today what we're going to use is this trace path function. So in order to do that, I need to twirl down my line 3, click on my path and hit trace path, click on the path and hit U on my keyboard. You can see it has this progress animation here, and if you look here, you can see the null actually follows that path, which is exactly what we want for this, because right now, because we have that, we can just come up to dot 3 over here. We can just parent it to our trace line, and you'll see now that just animates along that path perfectly. Now, I'm just going to hide the line and the dot for now because I want to animate this in quite a specific way. I want it to have some nice strong easing. So I'm going to come to about this point here, drop in a keyframe. I'm going to make this nice round 70. And I want to make this have quite a hard easing. So it's going to animate in quickly and then zoot right off. So you can see what happens when I've done that. It comes in quickly and then it animates off. But what I don't want is it stopping at this point. So I can select this keyframe, click on my graph editor icon to open my graph editor, and making sure that this point is selected, I can double click on it and check continuous lock outgoing to incoming. You'll see what that does in a second. So if I hit OK, I can now pull up this path. So if I hadn't checked that, I wouldn't be able to pull this up in one go. It would kind of separate the keyframes. Now that we've done that, I can pull that up and you can see what happens. The movement is now continuous. The ball is kind of animating in quick and animating off exactly how we want. And that's fantastic. Now I can make this whole process even simpler by duplicating this line, hitting U to open up my keyframes, coming to the end, and I can now show my dot 3 and parent it to our new trace line, and it's going to be animating along that same path in the same way. However, we don't want them to be exactly in sync with each other, so if I select this part of this animation and drag this back to somewhere around there, 40 seems good, you can see what happens now. These animate on together and animate off in this very interesting way. I'm loving that. Okay, now we're not even going to do a traditional trim path on this. Because we have this information from these trace paths, we can actually plug this information into a trim path, and I'll show you how to do that right now. So let's bring on our line. Let's drop in a trim path. If we look at this line here, trace path, trace line 3, we can see that goes from 0 to 70 to 100 again. And that basically will correspond quite directly to what we want our trim path end to do. So if I just hold down Alt, click on End to open up my expression box, I can click on this icon here, which opens up our pick whip, and I can just pick whip this progress. If I click out, this updates in response to the progress. That's just a really quick way to get the animation we're looking for. And we can do the exact same thing with our start keyframes. So if I hold Alt and click, grab the pick whip and come up to our second line for our second dot, click out, the start is being trimmed perfectly. And look how great that looks. Is that not flipping magical? Comment below the word magical if you think that's magical. Okay, so then the next thing that I would do at this point is basically duplicate these things a couple times. You know, bring this back, just offset some of the animation just so we get a nice loop. But just like a good old infomercial, I've actually pre-baked this turkey, and let me just show you that now. So this is the pre-baked turkey. This is what it looks like after I've repeated things a few times and basically added all the animation I want to. So this is the second animation that we're going to reverse engineer. We're going to focus on this part right here where it rotates and then match cuts into these squiggles that then come up and around and out. This is the path it kind of follows. So it's like matching there, comes out, then it pulls back in, and then comes out again. So what I've done is inside of Illustrator, I've made a suggestion of this path. So this will be our starting circle, and this of course is a suggestion of that middle part in the animation. So if I come into After Effects now, you can see I've just set this up with that same moving background, the gradients animating, and I've just made this little bubble in the center just to give us something to work around. And then I have the main circle and the main squiggle. So for starters, we're going to look at the main circle. So I'm just going to solo that. We're going to start with some path animation. So if I twirl down, come into path, drop in a keyframe there, then I'm going to move to about 16 frames in, drop another path keyframe. I'm just going to use my ruler to get an idea of where the path fits right now. You'll see why that's going to be helpful. And if you don't have your rulers active, you just need to hit Control R or Command R and they'll pop up. So there you go. Now if I select all of these path points, double click, I can now click on one of these handles or these points here and just hold Control. You'll see that just constrains it. And this is why I was using those ruler lines. So I can just match that up and make sure that I'm completing a full rotation here. I'm just going to come in and ease this actually. So I'm going to give this a really strong ease, just a full 100 ease, so it really whips. Then I'm going to come to about 13 frames. Just when it's at this point, I'm going to select everything. And I'm just going to pull it in so it looks like a single stroke, because that's pretty much what they have going on in the original at this perfect halfway point, and I think it looks good aesthetically. Okay, so I'm just going to come over to this keyframe, hold Control and click, and this creates what's called an auto Bezier, and this basically will just conserve the motion, the speed between these few frames, even if the easing here is very strong. So that's the first part of this animation done. The next thing we want to do is add some rotation. So the way to get the right motion is making this -90 and having it go to 0. So if I put on the right easing on that, as strong as this path animation, you'll see this is what we get. And that's exactly what we're looking for. Okay, so now that's pretty much done. Obviously it's unstyled, but we'll get to the styling later. So what I'm going to do is make sure this is cutting at this point, because what's going to happen is that it's going to actually cut into the squiggle. So we're going to change from one shape layer to another with a quick fast action. So let's show this main squiggle, and let's for now hide our main circle, and let's animate this. For starters, we need to add a trim path. So I'm going to drop that in. I'm going to drop in a keyframe on the end, and I'm basically going to bring this all the way down to something like 27. Okay, so that's where we're going to start, and then we're going to move maybe 12 frames ahead, drop another keyframe. We're going to pull this around to about 56. We're also going to drop in a start keyframe, and this is going to whip around to about 25. Then I'm going to move about 20, 22 frames ahead, and these are just going to both go to 100. And then once again, I'm going to use some really strong easing on this. I also want a bit of lengthening at this point. What I'll do is I will pull this keyframe out a few frames, drop an easy ease on it so it also whips out at this point. The one thing we don't want is this pause here. Just like some of the previous examples, that's really not what we're going for. We're looking for continuous fluid motion. So if I grab these one at a time, go pop into my graph editor, we're doing the same trick as before. Click on the continuous checkbox. I'm going to go back and do the same to the end keyframe. Now if we select both of these, we can pull them up. Okay, let's just get a feel for that. And maybe this can be lower. Yeah, that feels good. Okay, so already we can get a sense of that match cut, so let's take a look at our two pieces together. I like that. I think it could maybe come back one frame. Yeah, I think that actually works a lot better. Now, the one thing we want to do to this is getting that tapered stroke feel to it that we have in our reference. So in order to do that, we can actually just use the built-in shape layer functionalities. So if we twirl down group 1, twirl down stroke, twirl down taper, we can add a start length and a start width. I also want to change the stroke width, so we're going to do that as well. And then I'm going to just drop in keyframes for these at this point here. So for starters, our start length has to kind of happen quite quick. I'm looking for a kind of quick snap to something quite dramatic, so we get the taper quite quickly. I don't want this to be a perfect sharp edge. I'm going to start this width off at 50 and take it up to, I think I'm taking it down actually, yeah, so that's where I want it. I actually want it to start off thicker and slowly come to a sharper point. That looks good. And you know what, I'll ease that in the same way. So it's always a good idea to match your easing. It can really make things feel much more cohesive, and that's definitely a pro when animating. I'm just going to take this up to about 280 at this point, so we really get a nice thick stroke. Once again, strong easing. I pull this out a bit. I'm going to take this back down to 150 at this point. So it thickens up a bit, and then it thins out. And that's pretty much it. All we need to do is now make sure there are 2 of them. So if I duplicate this, I'm going to pop in a null. Because this goes right to the center, I can just parent the main swiggle to the null, and I can open the rotation on the null, change this to 180, then I can pretty much delete the null. So I'm just going to show up everything, and there you have it. All we used was trim paths to create this, and it has a really cool feel to it. We have this nice match cut happening and these nice little squiggles popping out. So now we're going on to the styling, and this is a really great opportunity to get familiar with a technique that uses layer styles. So if you click on shape layers and you right click and have a look at layer styles, you can see there are a bunch of options you can use here. And these are actually a great way to customize your layers, and they aren't often used. Okay, so for starters, we're going to drop in an inner shadow, and I already have the right color copied here, so I'll just paste that in. And I'm going to change this to normal, 100% opacity, and you can see it's added this little line there. Now if I come up to the distance and increase that to about 45, increase the size something like 35, and I'm going to change this to 45. That's what I'm looking for in a shadow right now. So the next thing we're going to do is add a highlight, and the way we can do that is using a bevel and emboss. So I'm going to come in, leave my shadow opacity or take it back down to 0, keep my highlight on screen in 75%, and I'm just going to increase the size to something like 160 and change the angle to something that's opposite the shadow. So around -160, we're getting a nice 3D effect already. Next thing I want to do is drop in a inner glow. Pull that down. I want to change the color to something again quite pinky. Yeah, something around there, like a kind of strange magenta. And this is on screen already, so it adds this this kind of color to the edge there. So if I increase the size to about 80, but then reduce the range a bit, something like 20. Yeah, I think that's a bit too big. I'm gonna drop that to about 40. Now you can see it just adds a little bit of extra 3D-ness to this object. Okay, the final thing that is gonna finish this off is adding a glow. I'm gonna drop in a glow into that main circle, and I'm gonna make sure that it's on top. So it's only in these areas, and I'm going to make it slightly bigger, the radius of 20. And that's exactly what we're looking for. And the great thing about layer styles is I can now just Control-C, copy all of them, and just paste them with Control-V directly onto my squiggles. And I have them matching those exact styles. Okay, so once again, I pre-baked all the refinements to this. We can have a look at that right here. I'm not going to go over everything here because the trim paths are the main point, but if you want to jump into the project files that are linked below, you can do so, and you can really decode all of this stuff and see exactly what I've done to achieve this effect. So yeah, thanks for watching. Project files are linked below, so be sure to check that out. I hope you've gained something valuable today, and if you have, why not subscribe so you can keep gaining XP and leveling up your motion design game?